Right then, welcome back, and hopefully you've uploaded your activity and watched the video on GDPR. So in that activity you identified some management reports you're responsible for, and those management reports are going to contain data, and data needs to be kept securely, and we'll come back and talk about that and GDPR in a minute. But with the increases in technology at our disposal, in the last decade or so particularly, technology has changed the way that organisations conduct their business. That goes for operational management as well, because it's at the heart of the business, as we've said in discussion 1, and part of it in session 1-3, and part of it is about managing data, managing production, continuous improvement, and the scope of technology to improve things has become massive with operating systems and processes. We looked at continuous improvement techniques like Lean, Six Sigma and Kaizen, but the new technologies are what is often going to allow us to reduce costs, improve the delivery process, standardize and improve quality, improve the focus on customization, and thereby creating that value added that we talked about. And those new technologies can be in the forms of many things. It can be equipment and materials that have been updated so it can improve or create value in the production process or in the services we provide. It can be automations of processes which are alleviating human error, increasing capacity. An inventory would be an example. Nowadays, counting it all up individually or manually, it can now be done by barcodes and then leading to automated ordering. There's also the way we store data. It used to be on old cards and stuff and notes, and now we have CRM software which will look at, so that's customer relationship management, and it'll be looking at preferences, their accounts, how we react to them, when we last spoke to them. We have social media, purchasing records, targets, promotional materials, sales, things such as individual customer accounts on our files that we would have not had years ago, and the amount of stuff and personal information we're storing has changed massively. And then there's stuff like planning software applications that can do everything from planning deliveries, planning processes, and then we're talking about online and the internet with sales and marketing, and also communications and the speed and transfer of data and instant pictures and reporting. So we have much more data at our fingertips due to technological changes, and we're much more to analyse and consider when we're planning and preparing for our management reports, and that brings with it a great responsibility. We need to be considering the implications of the way we store, manage and use that data. And you watched a video on GDPR, and it gave an overview of the details, the responsibilities, the punishments, etc. And the video was obviously from before it was introduced, and it's now in place, and from the 25th of May 2018 it superseded the UK Data Protection Act of 1998 with the new Act. And as he said in the video, it is a significant and wide-reaching in scope, and the new law brings a 21st century approach to data protection. It expands the rights of individuals to control how their personal information is collected and processed much more than before, and places a new obligation on the organisation to be more accountable for the data protection. So you can't just say, oh well, we didn't know. And we've seen recent examples of that from organisations. I can think of one, Morrison's, has recently been taken to court and held responsible for an employee who did something with the data. They claimed it wasn't their responsibility, but they've had to face massive consequences because it is their responsibility. So we really do have to think about it seriously and consider the consequences. And the new Act builds on what was there in the old Act and sets out controls for personal information as used by organisations, businesses and the government. Everyone responsible for using this data has to follow strict rules called the Data Protection Principles, and they're available in the resources for you to research and have a look at. And it sets out that organisations must, when using data, use it fairly and lawfully. When it's used, it must be for limited times and specifically for the purposes that it's only stated. It's used in a way that is adequate, relevant and not excessive. It is kept for no longer than is absolutely necessary for the purpose. It's handled according to the people's data protection rights. It's kept safe and secure, and it's not transferred outside the European Economic Area without adequate protection. So meeting this legislation is important for making sure that we don't breach the Data Protection Act, because that could result in sanctions or fines, but also the damage to reputation and the commercial competitiveness of our organisation. And the speaker in the video also outlined how GDPR has upgraded data protection, really by defining what we used to talk about sensitive data, but it defines it now as all data, any data on customers, stakeholders, any personal data that has an identifying characteristic and could identify a living individual is now classed as that sensitive data. So it could be a name, an ID number, a location, and you need to treat that information as personal data and make sure that it's being stored correctly and used correctly. And it even relates to commercially sensitive information that might be included in reports or management plans, because now we need to consider what that's used for, where it's stored, access management, so who has access to it and do they need access to it for their job, and how it is sent and distributed, so who and what method it's used to distribute it. So it may be that we don't think it includes us because we're not getting involved, and then suddenly we use some data in a management report and we have to be careful about where that's being distributed to, who has access to it, otherwise we could be breaking the Data Protection Act. So what sort of breaches of data protection are there and what sort of consequences? Well, the main offences relating to it are, one, the failure of data controllers, and that's the people who are deemed to be in charge of the information, to notify the Information Commissioner's office of any updates or any changes to the way they're keeping that data. So you may make changes as part of continuous improvements where you change the way the data is stored or the way it's kept or what you're using it for. Make sure you speak to your data protection officer within your organisation just to check that it's all in line with the next one is, as it was before, obtaining, disclosing, selling or offering to sell personal data without the consent of the person whose data it is. And that could be when we're collaborating with another organisation. They may be the data control of that information, or we may be. We need to be careful about sharing it with stakeholders. And we'll look at the consequences in a minute, but the ICO can issue formal notices, and if we break them, obviously we're deemed to be in breach of the Data Protection Act. And so what can the ICO do? Well, the ICO has the powers to take action against organisations that do not comply, obviously, to the Data Protection Act, and this can include things as criminal prosecutions for serious breaches, non-criminal enforcement, audits or checks on the organisations, then check they are complying, and there's monetary penalties. And I mentioned before breaching formal notices. Well, they can issue an informal enforcement notice which says that they believe the organisation is not applying with the data protection principles, which we talked about that are in the resources, or they can issue an information notice calling for the organisation to supply any information needed so that they can assess it and decide if it's acted against the Data Protection Act. So financial penalties, it could go to court, but as I say to people, the damage in reputation to the organisation is almost as big, if not bigger, than maybe the monetary penalties. There is a lot more information from the Information Commissioner's office in the resources, and you can look on their website about how much the monetary penalties can be and how far they can go. Right then, so let's just have a quick recap on what we've done in this session. The aims at the beginning were to understand the purpose of management reporting, and I think we discussed the different purposes and different reports, and you've done an activity looking at what you're responsible for. And then we said we'd understand effective technology use and the data security in an organisation. We said by the end of the session you'd be able to evaluate the features of a viable management report and explain when and how to use management reports. You said you'd be able to evaluate the use of technology in operational planning and management, and we've talked about it, but you'll have to look at your organisation and see where it fits in because it is different to every organisation, but we've talked about the areas it can improve on, and then explain the importance of data management and security in an organisation. We've just talked through the Data Protection Act and how important it is that we're managing data, not just for with upholding the law, but also for the commercial reputation of our company, and there's a lot more in the resources around that area that you can look at and how it would impact on your organisation. So let's have a look at what you've got to do now. So we've reached the end of this unit, and the next thing you've got to do is complete the unit assignment. There's a session for that, and it gives a clear explanation, and there's some resources and guidance as to what you need to do preparing and completing that. If you've got any questions or you're unsure of what you need to do, how you need to do it, speak to your assessor and they should be able to give you guidance. Once you've completed that and uploaded it and your assessor's aware of it and can make an assessment judgment on it, you can move on to the next unit, which is Project Management Unit 508.